Namaste and greetings. I, Mahima Kapoor, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend a warm welcome to you all to the IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a distinguished lecture on China's grand strategy as part of the series, The State of International Affairs, #Diplomacy Dialogue. This discussion is being organized by the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies and delivered by Dr. Rafiq Dossani. I'm honored to introduce the speaker, Dr. Rafiq Dossani. Sir is the director of the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy, a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He works on education, finance, regional development, security, trade, and technology issues. His recent projects include security in the Korean Peninsula, the Belt and Road Initiative, Track 2 diplomacy between the United States and China, and Asia's democratization. Previously, Sir was director of Stanford University's Center for South Asia and a senior research scholar at Stanford University's Institute for International Studies. He holds a PhD in finance from Northwestern University, an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
We are fortunate to have Major General Dr. P.K. Chakravorty, VSM retired, and Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh as the discussants for the session. Dr. P.K. Chakravorty is a strategic thinker on security issues. Welcome, sir. Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh is an associate fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Welcome, sir. The deliberation is being moderated by Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI. I invite Dr. Mehta to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Good morning and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you, Mahima, for leading us into the discussion today. Very recently, Chinese Communist Party celebrated 100 years of its establishment. Xi Jinping, the president of China, has evoked sentiments of Chinese prowess ever since he has assumed office, and specifically so during the centenary celebrations of the CCP. He made it clear that China would no longer be subject to any foreign bullying and continue on the unstoppable momentum towards rejuvenation. As China continues in its quest for establishing its geopolitical might and influence, what are the elements of its grand strategy? Is it overt strategic thinking articulated by the military, or does it also include Beijing's diplomatic maneuvers? What shapes this grand strategy, and what should the responses of other major powers, including that of the United States, be? How successful might China be at implementing its grand strategy goals over the next 2 decades? So to understand all these in detail and also beyond, the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies is pleased to host this distinguished lecture and welcome Dr. Rafiq Dossani, an expert on the subject who's been studying China for a long time now. We also have with us Major General P.K. Chakravorty, Dr. Prashant Kumar and Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh, who would be discussing Dr. Dossani's lecture and would be sharing their perspectives. So without taking any more time, I yield the floor to Dr. Dossani. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Simi, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Mahima, also, and thanks to the organizers at IMPRI. I have a slide presentation, so maybe you could put that up. So my basic storyline, next slide, please, is that there's a well-defined idea of grand strategy. The United States in contemporary times is probably the most well-known for its grand strategy. Historically, empires have had grand strategies, including the British Empire. But this focus of this talk will be more contemporary. So I'll be spending a lot of time trying to understand US grand strategy and how it's changed, and then take up the case of China, which has been thrust on the stage in a more overt way since Xi Jinping came into office in 2012. So I'll spend a lot of time on China's grand strategy since 2012, how US has responded to that, and then derive some conclusions that are broader than just about China and the US, and leave for the Q&A and my esteemed discussants' comments to look at topics that might be more of interest to, say, an Indian audience. So with that, the next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. So defining grand strategy, as you can see, it's a national plan to convert a country's priorities and interests into actions with specified resources and associated timelines. Theoretically, the belief is that there should be three characteristics to grand strategy. First, it should advance national security, that is, preserve and advance the sovereignty, safety, territorial integrity, and power position of a nation. It's long-term in its thinking. So the second point brings that out. It concerns the evolution and integration of policies that should operate for decades and even for centuries. And third, it should be holistic. It should involve all the resources of the state, including the state's military, diplomatic, technological, and economic resources in terms of resources as well as in achieving the broader objectives. So that's a fairly sort of well-accepted definition. Now, how does it get applied in the cases that I'm going to raise? Next slide, please. So one of the points I'd like to stress here is that grand strategy depends a lot on the autonomy, the strategic autonomy, the autonomy of a nation to make strategies. You know, in many cases, that autonomy is not there. So a key question that will be asked is, how much autonomy does a nation have in determining its grand strategy? Well, the reality is that small and medium powers may not have much autonomy, and in which case the grand strategy of such powers must be set in reaction to big power grand strategy. And I have some examples coming up on the right. The third point is that even big power autonomy is never absolute. For example, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US took great account to understand the others' grand strategy before deciding on their own or manifesting their own. So to give you some examples that are not US and China, Japan. You know, there was a period in 1960 to 1985 when Japan's high growth rate after the World War II ended made it look for regional eminence. And what it did was it concentrated on infrastructure, trade, and aid strategies. For example, probably the most famous of these strategies was Japan's promotion of the Asian Development Bank in 1966. And there were many other such initiatives for different purposes. This was going quite well for Japan, except that the United States wasn't too happy with Japan achieving prominence at its expense. And so one of the things it did was, with the Asian Development Bank, ensure that the bank was headquartered in Manila, not in Tokyo, which was a big disappointment to the Japanese. And then, of course, the famous Plaza Accord of 1987, when the US and its allies in Europe insisted that Japan revalue the yen from something like 250 yen to the dollar to about 100 yen to the dollar. So it was a massive, massive upvaluation. And that effectively ended Japan's grand strategic ambition because the economy tanked for the next 20 years. So that's an example of a period of high strategic autonomy. An example of low strategic autonomy is South Korea's quest for unification with North Korea after the Korean War ended in 1953, or at least in a truce. Now, South Korea and North Korea both desired unification, particularly South Korea as it grew wealthier. But this was always subject to the interests of its treaty ally, the United States, which was a more powerful ally than Korea. And so with the US being primarily interested till 1991 with containing the Soviet Union, a country with which with North Korea was allied, that effectively stopped South Korea's initiatives for unification. Anything that South Korea would propose would be stopped by the United States on the grounds that it would hurt its bigger quest to end the Cold War. When the Cold War ended in 1992, North Korea, realizing that its back was to the wall with China not a very favorable ally at that point, despite a treaty, began developing its nuclear weapons. And that raised US concerns about weaponization. And again, the result on unification between South and North Korea was that the US held it back. So that's an example of a country which has not been able to exercise its grand strategy because of low strategic autonomy. Next slide, please. So how does grand strategy manifest itself? It does it primarily through institutions and initiatives. Some examples you can see here. So the institution initiatives which might be multilateral or intergovernmental, regional or bilateral. They involve diplomatic, economic, technological and military resources. And they seek to achieve, as I mentioned earlier, diplomatic, social and economic welfare and military objectives. So some examples are the UN and its agencies, which are multilateral agencies, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, which are intergovernmental agencies, the ASEAN and the Quad, which have different levels of formality, of course, but they're regional initiatives. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is both bilateral, such as the CPEC corridor in Pakistan, and regional, such as the Southeast Asia, China Rail Link. And I'll have a little more to say about the PRI later. And then there could be mutual defense treaties, which are typically bilateral or regional. So for example, the US-Japan alliance is a bilateral treaty. NATO, SEATO in its old days, these are examples of regional treaties. The United States is a champion of treaties. It has treaties with over 50 countries in South America, in all over the world. And we can discuss that later if you'd like. And then, of course, there are non-institutional manifestations of grand strategy, which include disaster relief, the famous Iraq War, coalition of the willing. They're short-term, they're non-institutional, very purpose-specific. But they too, in a sense, manifest grand strategy, as we've discussed. And just to point out, as the last column does, that resources and objectives may not overlap. For example, the United Nations uses diplomatic, economic, and military resources of countries, but the objectives are diplomatic and social and economic welfare. By and large, they're not military objectives, even the peacekeeping ones. And we can discuss this more later. In the interest of time, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, I now take up sort of a fairly large case study, that of the United States. Next slide. So between 1945 until 1991, when the Cold War ended, the United States grand strategy was largely built around institutions of two types. First, it promoted global institutions such as the UN and its agencies to support America's socio-economic and diplomatic interests. Broadly speaking, these were the market economy, respect for human rights, and in the process, Soviet containment. The institutions of primary focus for diplomatic and social welfare purposes were the United Nations and its agencies. Economic development was addressed through the IMF, World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and its successor, the WTO in 1995. And for influence, the US relied on its being the major contributor to the budgets of these institutions and providing political leadership, providing the leadership, for example, the IMF and the World Bank are traditionally headed by either the United States in the case of the World Bank and by a European ally in the case of the IMF. This has been a problem in recent years. The problems began when Japan was becoming prominent and it sought to increase its share in the IMF and the World Bank, as well as get UN Security Council permanent presence, but was not able to make headway. Then again, when China started growing, it tried to increase its contributions to IMF and World Bank, as well as its share of the UN budget. It's already the second largest contributor, but has not been able to make the kind of headway in some cases. It's done very well in terms of building its influence in the United Nations and its agencies, as we'll discuss later. So that was one prong of the US strategy. The other prong was to meet security interests. The first prong met the diplomatic and economic interests. The second prong was to promote regional and bilateral security alliances, such as NATO, the US-Japan Security Treaty, to protect its defense interests. And why did it not do larger global kinds of alliances for defense? That's really an interesting topic. One is, of course, the interests of allies in Europe would be very different from allies in Asia, even though there's some convergence these days because of China, but also because of the way the US organized itself for defense. It had a Pacific Command, it had a Central Asia Command, and so on. So that was the reason why you didn't see too much of multilateral global security alliances, and even a preference for bilateral over regional. For example, between the US, Korea, and Japan, the US preferred to ally separately with Korea and with Japan on the grounds that it would give it more power dealing with each ally separately than to have the two of them ganging up on it. Just as well, given the problems of Japan and Korea. Next slide, please. Okay, so to summarize Grand Strategy 1945 to 1991, it was largely institutional by the US. It concerned the UN and other global agencies and institutions for social welfare, diplomatic and economic objectives. And then the security side was taken care of by regional and bilateral alliances, as you can see. Next slide. So China started entering the picture as far as the US was concerned first in the 1970s, when Nixon's rapprochement with China achieved the objective of China switching sides from the Soviet Union and North Vietnam to the US side in the Vietnam War, and generally ceasing to support communist regimes elsewhere, such as in Afghanistan. And the price for China promised by the UN was permanent membership of the UN Security Council and later derecognition of Taiwan. So that was the first big one. And then sort of China focused on growth from 1980 onwards, did not do anything that was considered geopolitical. And so it stayed till about 2001. And the last big institutional approach where the US supported China was helping China become a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. And in return, there's always a price to pay. China supported the US's diplomatic and military initiatives in Afghanistan and Korea, although it, like many other Western countries, including France and Germany, opposed the invasion of Iraq. So during this period, all the way from really the late 70s till 2012, China focused on growth and kept a low geopolitical profile. And this was furthered by a generation of fairly weak political leaders after Deng Xiaoping. For example, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were considered weak leaders, good at building economic capacity, but really not interested in the geopolitics or even regional issues. An example is the South China Sea Islands, or so-called islands in the Spratlys, which consist of about 60 land features or islands. And China laid claim to them as a successor country to Taiwan after it joined the UN Security Council as a permanent member. And these 60 features were undecided. But meanwhile, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and Taiwan went on a island grabbing spree. Currently out of the 60 islands, Vietnam controls 29. China has, I believe, 7. So, and those two were all in recent years. So till Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin were in power, China really didn't bother about what was happening even in its own neighborhood, the South China Sea. That changed with Xi Jinping, as we'll come to. And also the second point is that Chinese grand strategy was largely limited to East and Southeast Asia and focused on economic integration of these regions with China. So in effect, China's strategies did not influence US strategies till 2012. Next slide, please. So between 1992 and 2012, the US was the sole superpower. It tried to use the same approach of its grand strategy that had served it well, but it was less successful than before. I'll show you a slide, the next slide, on one indicator of the challenges the US faced, which was the use of the veto. The forces that emerged really were against each other. There were small states after 1991 that allied with the US very quickly. They said, we don't have any strategic autonomy. We're happy to get out of the Soviet umbrella, typically those in Eastern Europe. However, unexpectedly for middle powers, which had been looking for strategic autonomy, Korea being an example, which had serious issues after World War II with Japan, they tried to use this period to develop strategic autonomy to deal with internal, bilateral, and regional issues that had not been possible in the Cold War. Meanwhile, China invested more in multilateral institutions, where it is now the UN, where it's the second contributor after the US. The US has 22% and China pays 15% of the budget. But China also invested diplomatic capital. For example, it's the largest provider of arms, of people to UN peacekeeping initiatives, and also the World Bank and the IMF. But still, over this period, the US was able to keep China from exercising significant influence in these institutions. As I mentioned, this in large part because of the weak leadership in China. Next slide. Yeah, here you see the use of the veto. It's quite interesting that if you look at this between 1946 and the present time, you can see the use of the veto by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So till 1991, Soviet Union stroke Russia was the largest user of the veto. And that continued after the Cold War period ended. But look at the change in the US. The US really started using the veto in a big way from 1970 and has continued being an active user, the second largest user of the veto after the Cold War ended. China, by contrast, hardly used the veto. It used the veto just once pre the Cold War. That was in some matter relating to Bangladesh. And since then, it's been a more active user of the veto in a variety of such circumstances: Syria, Brazil, many regions of the world, showing its willingness to exercise global power. And so a change in its interests. And many of those vetoes are after Xi Jinping came into power. Next slide, please. So what changed US perceptions of China since 2012? As I've been hinting all along, the arrival of Xi Jinping as China's leader was accompanied by significant regional and global geopolitical and developmental initiatives by China. Many of you would be aware of Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, where it's not only claimed more land, but also reclaimed more land, and in a way that seems to challenge the interests of the littoral countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and so on, Vietnam, of course. This is kind of an interesting topic because, really speaking, those islands and their reclaimed features are not worth much. They neither have geo-economic significance in terms of hydrocarbon or fisheries reserves, nor do they have military significance. I mean, they're based on reclaimed land. They're far from the Chinese mainland. They're within the exclusive economic zones of some of the other Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, and are easily challenged militarily. In fact, I had the head of PACOM some years ago tell me he could take out all those islands in a day if he wanted to. So, but what you're seeing is increasing challenges to Japan in the East China Sea and to Taiwan across the Taiwan Strait. I mean, from a Chinese point of view, there are explanations, whereas Japan argues that it is the controlling entity of the Senkaku Islands, or what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands. From a Chinese point of view, that's not the case. In 1982, there had been an agreement between China, Japan, and the United States that these islands would be under Japanese control, but sovereignty would not be decided till a later date. And then President Obama comes in and says, we recognize Japanese sovereignty over these islands, which China then challenged. And one we can discuss later, Taiwan and others. The second thing that happened was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was formed before Xi Jinping came in, late 90s. It started becoming very successful as China and Russia came closer and accomplished several diplomatic, economic, and military goals. And of course, now India is a member. And third is the sort of the grand Belt and Road Initiative that Xi Jinping promoted to develop infrastructure links between China and partner countries. And I'll have a little more to say about that a little later. The second thing that happened to affect US perceptions was in the unexpected growth of China in the 2000-2010 decade. Already by the 1990s, China had emerged as a champion economic growth case study. But surprisingly, whereas most people expected with its population issues and so on, the global integration that the World Trade Organization enabled, membership of that enabled, allowed China to grow at over 10% per annum over this decade. And that gave China unprecedented material power for its ambitions. To give you sort of the reason, in a sense, if you look at its savings rate, it's currently at 45%. It's over 3 times that of the US, which is around 15% now. But actually, on a long-term basis, it's much lower than that. But even taking 15%, it's 3 times. Its GDP is 2/3 of the US, PPP adjusted. So its total new investable capital is actually twice that of the US. So even though the US is a much bigger country economically, if you look at what's available to invest in initiatives like the BRA, the People's Liberation Army, etc., China actually has twice the funds on a PPP adjusted basis than the United States. I did a similar calculation for India, and it's at about 25% of the US. Not insignificant and surely could be better deployed, but you can see the gap. And then the third key factor was the unexpected and again unprecedented economic integration of China with East and Southeast Asia since 2000. And this raised economic security risks for the US. What happened here is that whereas till the year 2000, China was integrated in the supply chains of East and Southeast Asia, but it was not a critical piece. It was a large piece, but economically not considered critical. The value add was small, the technology used was basic. That changed dramatically between 2000 and 2010, so that today, if China was not a part of the chain, there would not just be a quantity effect, there would be a significant quality effect. So that has raised worries, significant worries for the United States. And then finally, of course, sometimes it all boils down to domestic politics, saving US manufacturing jobs. Since the Washington Club plan of 2000, this has been a mantra. India suffered from that in 2001 downturn. And now it's China's turn to help America save its manufacturing jobs. So these are what changed US perception, saying this is no longer a small issue for us. Next slide, please. So the result was the US invested less in institutions in which China had gained power, particularly the UN and WTO, but also regional groupings such as ASEAN. And the feeling in the US is ASEAN's gone over to the dark side of China. Instead of confronting China through the institutions, it said, let's do it more directly, investing more capital in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly with India, Japan, and Taiwan, and reducing its commitment to other areas such as the Middle East, as we most recently saw. The result was a reduction in multilateralism and institutional approaches, so moving away from sort of the long-term, somewhat less flexible institutional approach and its replacement by bilateralism and deals. Next slide, please. Okay, I think enough said on the US. We move on to China's grand strategy now. Next slide, please. So let me just start with a couple of maps. The Belt and Road Initiative, which sometimes doesn't get the press I think that it should have in India in terms of what it's accomplishing. It is an economic and a strategic diplomatic challenge to all the countries in the Asia Pacific, and India needs to understand that at its peril, in my opinion. So you can see the blue line underneath is sort of an ocean-going Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially the building of ports by China. You see one spur ending in Kolkata. That's not quite correct, actually. It should be a little to the right there in Bangladesh, in Sitwe port in Myanmar, and Bangladesh. But then it goes down to Sri Lanka, where you see it's not just at Hambantota now, but also Colombo, continues to Nairobi, where China is building a port in Mombasa, Kenya, and then of course Athens, and several ports are being built in Greece and Italy and Turkey. So interesting that the Belt and Road Initiative, which was designed as a development initiative, is being taken by China to developed countries as well. So that's the seafaring route, and then you see on top is the land route, which is the belt. Don't ask me why the sea route is called the road and the land route is called the belt, but that's how it is. So, you can see there it connects up through pipelines, through power lines, through roads, through rail links, China with Central Asia and Europe, as well as Russia. And this is not just theory. So next slide will give you an example of what's happening. Next slide, please. So in 2011, there were 17 China-Europe trains which carried goods worth 600 million. Between Xi'an, which you can see in the map on the right side of China, and Athens, which is in Greece on the left. That's just as an example. The trip time was 30 days, which is exactly the same as it took by ship. And it cost about the same. So it was seen as competitive in those days as well. Of course, much less than air in terms of time. But fast forward to 2020, and those 17 trips have become 12,400, with roughly a 50% growth each year for the last few years. The freight carried last year was worth 60 billion. It's a huge increase. And the trip time is now down to 12 days and falling. And they expect that it will stabilize for freight at around 8 or 9 days. So at that speed and the low costs, even though the costs have recently gone up after the pandemic, but so have they gone up for seafaring freight. China-Europe by rail has become extremely competitive. This has been great for the countries on the way. They're all collecting toll fees, in Central Asia. And as they develop, they're developing stops there. They're developing east-west corridors to take advantage of the north-south drift of the Belt and Road. Let me give you another example of this. Next slide, please. So it's closer to the heartland of India. You have the Pan-Asia railway network currently being built by China. It consists of 3 routes. There's a central route that goes through Laos and then meets at Bangkok and goes down to Singapore. There's the western route which connects via Myanmar, and then there's an eastern route which connects via Vietnam. So note that Vietnam, which is has difficulties in its relations with China, is still a willing partner in these investments, and that's because the two countries have become tightly integrated economically. So this, of course, this thing is just in its early days. I think the most progress has been in the route from Kunming to Laos. The Thai part, because of their recent troubles, has been an issue. The Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur-Singapore link has been tendered out. The Chinese will probably win that one as well, since they're willing to fund it. But they already have the contract for Kuala Lumpur to Bangkok. So here you see something that's happening very fast. Is going to be transformative in terms of its effect on economic growth, and it all connects to China. That's the point. To go from Vientiane in Laos to Rangoon in Myanmar, you have to actually go via Kunming, unless later on these countries develop the capacity to build their east-west links. Next slide. Here I wanted to bring out, from a Chinese perspective, what they are seeing as the US strategy to contain China. So what you see here is that the first column, Clinton rule coincided with Jiang Zemin. It was a period of strategic economic cooperation where Clinton worked very hard to get China into the WTO to enable kind of fair competition on trade. So it was a period of cooperation. When Bush came in, the war on terror began, and with Hu Jintao, an era of cooperation on the security side began. Particularly, China sided with the US, as I mentioned, on key issues, Afghanistan, North Korean nuclearization. And meanwhile, the WTO successfully continued the competition based on rules-based trade. Then comes Obama with Hu Jintao, and for a while it's great while Hu Jintao is there, but then Xi Jinping comes and you can see the beginnings of competition on security sides as well as confrontation on the security side, the East China Sea, as I mentioned. And then, of course, Trump, followed by Biden. Biden has assumed Trump's categorization of China as a strategic competitor and named it a chief rival. And under Xi Jinping, you can see that cooperation has, to an extent, happened on North Korea. I don't think it would happen now, given the state of their relationships. But when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, the Djibouti base, space, these are areas of competition. And not surprisingly so. I mean, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's already spent about 300 billion. It's become the world's largest foreign aid program. And the era of confrontation has become really serious and wide-ranging. It covers the East and South China Seas, trade and intellectual property, Iran sanctions, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the pandemic. In the interest of time, I think these are quite clear. We can come back to that in the Q&A. Next slide. So what changed Chinese perceptions of the US from 2012? From being a partner to being a rival. I remember even till 3 years ago, I used to regularly get invitations at RAND from the Chinese government saying, let's have a celebration of China-US 40 years of friendship. All that has stopped now. For the last 2 years, it's even hard to speak to anyone in China from the United States. So the 2012 pivot to East Asia was the starting point. And then when the Trans-Pacific Partnership was finalized, it was portrayed by President Obama as an anti-China initiative. As he noted, America, not countries like China, will write the rules of the road in the 21st century. And then, of course, more recently under President Trump, the naming of China as a strategic competitor and later as its chief rival. And then the era of sanctions and tariffs to prevent access to sensitive technology, to protect US jobs. So these have completely changed the perceptions of China about the US. Which views, from its point of view, a strategy to contain China as a premium, as the primary goal of American grand strategy. Next slide, please. So I'm almost at the end here. Let me I put forward Chinese grand strategy in this way so you can compare it with the US grand strategy at the present time. And you can see the difference between the institutional and the non-institutional. So China's objective is to prevent containment by the US. It sees countries like Japan, India, Taiwan as being roped in to confront confront China on behalf of the US. Much as we might hope that India has strategic autonomy in these issues from a Chinese point of view, India has also gone over to the dark side. So what is the Chinese strategy then? One is it supports existing key global institutions in which it has made inroads, particularly the UN and its agencies such as the WHO, WTO, and ASEAN. It promotes new institutions where it does not find that it can make headway within the US promoted order. For example, AIIB, although it cooperates with the World Bank and others, is intended as a long-term competitor to the World Bank and the ADB. The BRI, which you've discussed, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, that should be the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, RCEP, which even though it's an ASEAN-sponsored initiative, has really been taken forward by China, and the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, CAI, with Europe. The third prong of the strategy is its formal security arrangements are regional rather than bilateral. And that might reflect that, it's very hard to make bilateral arrangements. It has very few formal bilateral arrangements on security. And so the fourth one is bilateral security arrangements are mostly informal, example with Russia and Cambodia. It will tactically exploit US weak spots. It sees some desire of Europe to gain strategic autonomy and of Korea. So it will look for openings in that. And it will clarify and support red lines. You've seen what's happened in Hong Kong with the new security law, Chinese actions in the Taiwan Strait. And it will build soft power through non-institutional support for crises. I think one of the problems China faces is being not being a democracy, being an authoritarian state. It's hard for it to build soft power in the usual ways. And the US objective, on the other hand, its grand strategy is to contain China. So it tries to control China's access to US markets and technology. I think we've discussed that. It promotes US integration into Asian supply chains. Let's see whether that succeeds. I think it's going to be pretty tough. Renew the pivot to Asia with its Indo-Pacific strategy and focus on China's weak spots, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the Indian situation, revive Southeast Asia country alliances and partnerships. Currently, it has alliances with Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, among others. Next slide. Okay, let me wrap up. Next slide, please, with my conclusions. So China's grand strategy has moved from an institution-based socio-economic strategy to institutional and non-institutional diplomatic, socio-economic, and military strategies. The US, meanwhile, has moved to less formal strategies. In some ways, this gives China's strategies longevity, but also less flexibility. If it's institutional, it would want to follow through on that strategy. To help in that process, it is in the process of drawing red lines, and some of which, perhaps including for India, will raise geopolitical and economic risks for other powers. Okay, I think I've spoken enough. I'll be very glad to hand over to my discussant at this stage and later take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Very, very informative. And thank you for this wonderful presentation. So I would invite Major General Dr. P.K. Chakravorty to make his comments first. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simi. Thank you. Thank you very much, Simi. I must firstly thank Dr. Rafiq Dossani for a beautiful presentation. And not only that, he was extremely kind in giving us the slides a day before, which allowed us to really know what he's going to speak. I'm extremely grateful to you to understand. And I must say it was an excellent talk by all standards. When you look at his origin in St. Stephen's College, where my own son was, and he today is an assistant professor in the United States at College Station, I find a lot of similarities between him and Dr. Dossani. Well, notwithstanding that, I must say that though having a PhD, I'm more of a practitioner. And being a practitioner, I've served 3 years in Vietnam, which was possibly, and these were years 1996 to 1999. If you take these years, Deng Xiaoping just passed away, and Deng Xiaoping, he spoke about it. And then I went along with the United States Defense Secretary to every battlefield where the US and Vietnam fought. Believe me, the US won all battles. The United States military wins all battles, but they lost the war. Well, on Sunday, I don't think anybody, including President Biden or even the director of the CIA,
Sir,
Yeah,
really sorry
yeah.
to interrupt. If you could just adjust your headphones for a bit, because there's some noise coming when you're speaking. There's
All right. Okay, I'll remove them. Just I'll remove them then.
Yeah, this is much better, sir.
Now it's
Yes,
clear.
yes. Thank you. This is much better, sir.
Okay, I've removed the headphones. The headphones were basically to hear others. Now you can hear. Okay, I'll now proceed. Now, coming into the nuts and bolts of grand strategy, I must firstly confess India does not have even a national security strategy. It's known to all of you. And often we have tried to what you call state that we must have something. Now, the point made out, the definition is that a grand strategy must last continuously. Believe me, it's not possible. And Dr. Dossani's lecture itself brings out very, very clearly the US still continues to be the sole superpower. If it continues to be the sole superpower, how do we deal with it? The only way to deal with it is an asymmetric means. And when you come to dealing with asymmetric, you have to resort to sub-conventional warfare. You've got to result in discussions which necessarily does not have to be respected. I have met Zalmay Khalzad, who has been negotiating for the United States right now, and even for many years with the Taliban at Doha. Now, believe me, you can't take everybody by academic rules. As a military man, I've always learned not all treaties are respected, not all alliances are going to occur as they happen. And lastly, please don't set any deadlines. Like today, we set a deadline, the 31st August, everybody will leave, the United States will leave Afghanistan. Having been somebody who has been into, I mean to say, insurgency and been fighting insurgents, let me put it to you, I have made it very clear to many US generals, to many diplomats, to many academics who visited India, to get into deadlines is to put what you call an issue which you can never, never undergo. Grand strategies are nice, but they need review. Believe me, they need review by the day. Now, today, Biden says by 31st August, we are going to get everybody out of Afghanistan. As a military man, let me see one military person. I've just to hear Fox News on United States, and you'll get the answer what the Americans are thinking. Believe me, things are not so easy, particularly when it comes to execution on ground. Grand strategies must lead to correct executions. And today, the warfare, there's nothing tactical. Everything is strategic. Everything has become strategic. There's nothing operational. There's nothing, because today, an ant can go and trouble an elephant. So therefore, the Taliban agrees on an issue. You build up a force whom the United States and the president calls. Even I remember talking to one of the British generals, and he was posted in Iraq, that what will happen, and even General David Petraeus, that what will happen when you leave is that this force will collapse. Strategy has to be related to the fighting capability. Believe me, the first point of the grand strategy is security. And when you come to security, what is the fighting capability? I carried out an analysis, and when I was in Vietnam with the US Defense Attaché, fighting capabilities in the Asia lies with China, with Japan, Vietnam, India, Pakistan. No doubt Kamala Harris is today in Vietnam. And she would be she has already visited Singapore, and she is on her way to Vietnam. The next issue I would like to say is autonomy. We all talk of strategic autonomy. Let me tell you, nobody is autonomous. You may have a lot of power. What do you do? Today, if the Taliban doesn't allow the Americans to get from Kabul city or from Herat to Kabul airport, what does the United States do? Are you going to launch another offensive? Is NATO planning another offensive? So your entire strategies become dependent. And warfare today with subconventional and asymmetric things, autonomy has become a big question mark. I'm just giving today just for one thing. 1971, India encountered Pakistan in so-called East Pakistan. We had to sign a treaty with the Soviet Union. And look at what the United States, UK did. Nixon, Kissinger wanted the Seventh Fleet to move in. The US strategy was certainly not for us. And definitely we had to depend on then the Soviet Union for it. So grand strategy, could we continue the grand strategy? 93,000 prisoners we had to hand over. So next I want to come to Quad. Dr. Dossani, I would like you to say Quad is a diplomatic and a military alliance. I'm afraid as on date it's a diplomatic alliance. Or shall we put it a diplomatic dialogue? It's not an alliance, you certainly didn't say it's an alliance, but militarily, Quad as on date has nothing. Yes, we had Quad meetings at various levels, but we are diplomatic. The moment you get the military in, and now I'll come in, the military is a separate issue. And please understand, Japan was captured militarily. Korea exists today because of military issues. The Taliban has entered because of military issues. Diplomacy possibly was when the British ruled the world. I'm afraid that diplomacy by itself just does not work. Smart power is the answer. Smart power also requires hard power. I've spoken about asymmetric warfare. Now I'll come to the South China Sea. It pointed out that South China Sea has got no importance. Now, believe me, China's biggest problem is that China today realizes if it has to, what you call militarily act, the Chinese Navy has to move firstly to the Western Pacific, and next they have to move to the Indian Ocean. Unlike India, which has great open seas, for it to move to the Indian Ocean, China is today has to make sure that the islands in the South China Sea don't prevent the Chinese Navy from moving into the region, which would what you call allow it or give it the freedom of maneuver to be in ports which he brought out. I just correct that there's no port in Bangladesh as here. It's Chakravorty, which is in Myanmar, or which is close to Sitaway. And Sonadia in Chittagong was supposed to be given to the Chinese. A lot of problems are taking place, but definitely Sri Lanka, Hambantota, as well as Colombo have landed up with the Chinese. And we have luckily still holding on to Maldives. We have Djibouti, and China definitely in a big way is already in the Indian Ocean, with Gwadar possibly going to be a sea command for the Chinese. Now, who are the countries? What is China's grand strategy militarily when you look at it? It is focused on a few very important countries. First, North Korea. Second, as he brought out, possibly Cambodia. Well, Cambodia is a very, very small country. And third is Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is very strategically located. Today, with Gwadar coming in, today with India losing its what you call clout in Afghanistan, and possibly even not having Chabar to what you call act as a counter, the grand strategy of the US and this region needs a drastic takeover. Now, the next I would like to talk about the East Sea and discussions which he had with the PACOM that in one day he can take over all the South China Sea islands. I would like to place a $1 million bet with PACOM to please come and take over these islands in one day. The aircraft carriers have been moving around. It's very nice to hear PACOM commander. When I questioned them, they told me the best forces in Asia today are the Afghan forces. And what is the American way of forces? give equipment, Black Hawk helicopters, A-29 fighters, the best, please. Being a soldier, believe me, the best weapon is the human being. You play the Indian army against the Taliban, let me see the Taliban capture even 1 millimeter. Please, because the whole issue of fighting or combat is how you can die. You can give a lot of your weapons. You can bring in artificial intelligence. I write on all these subjects. But believe me, we have seen Vietnam, we have seen Iraq, we have seen now Afghanistan, 3 clear examples. And we have seen how the grand strategy of the United States needs course correction. Next, the United States lays its belief. Nixon goes, Pakistan helps for a meeting with China, and the Kissinger and the Chinese enable the Chinese to switch sides. Russia is the greatest achievement of the United States, that the Soviet Union breaks up. It's a great achievement for Andy Marshall, for all the grand strategists. But I would put it very clearly, it doesn't mean that Russia is out of the box. Russia is today in Afghanistan, and so is China, and so are many other countries which are feeding the Taliban. Another thing I want to say in your grand strategy, the US applies sanctions, which he has not talked of. Sanctions were applied against India. I've often said the more sanctions you apply, the more you make that country firm, because he starts then asserting. I was asked the other day, will Taliban run or short of money? I said Taliban will receive more and more money if you apply sanctions. And I don't have the time because I think I'm already on the other side of time to say something. BRI. I think the BRI, the Chinese thought it would be a big thing, and Xi Jinping thought that it would be something which is great. There are big questions which are rising within China about the success of the BRI. You can have railway lines going to Europe. They are possibly planning a railway line under the Pacific, which will be going and which will be connecting to the Canada or to Mexico. Now, all these could be great. But if you think you have conquered Europe by the railway lines, or if you have conquered what you call by some sea routes, I assure you that in today's subcontinental warfare, these are issues which need serious thinking, serious discussion. I think that to this extent, the United States has rightly focused back on B3W, which is nothing but the extension of the TPP, and also showing its presence into what these regions of Southeast Asia were. Now, I would talk about Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao. They were not weak leaders. Deng Xiaoping, as a matter of fact, is the first man who got the People's Liberation Army under control. He stopped all their business, he stopped all issues, and he was very intelligent. And he's intelligent even today. Even in the Politburo meetings, which I very closely follow, Deng Xiaoping is there. Hu Jintao was certainly weak and could not. As far as Xi Jinping is concerned, very powerful, very assertive. Let's see how long he lasts. Because don't forget, the Chinese are not the same which were there under Mao. Having visited China and having traveled on the railway, which is said from Kunming, I've traveled to Hanoi, actually, I can tell you one thing, the Chinese people themselves won't allow things to happen. Small issue. At the IDSA, before Dr. Prashant Singh, the Chinese scholars had come once. I said, well, Xi Jinping now today is going to be a ruler for life. I think he can sort out the Indo-China problem straight away. The professor gave me an answer. It's not that easy. So what we need is possibly much deeper intelligence, much greater issues, and please don't believe what you sign. Don't believe what a person tells you in Doha. These are meant for consumption over cookies and tea. I think the Americans must not exit Bagram the way they existed and leave one airfield for the entire American population to exist. Same thing happened in South Vietnam. I mean, I don't want to repeat all these issues. And similar thing happened with the exit in Iraq. Now, therefore, why have a grand strategy when you really cannot execute it? The first thing in grand strategy, according to me, is unpredictability. And next is don't believe anyone unless there's definite evidence. Military men are not professors, they are not academics. Those who are people from the Taliban or from other areas who are irregular forces don't have any principles. It's always better to err on the other side. Lastly, alliances in today's world are going to be all informal, as you correctly brought out. And therefore, the United States definitely needs to review its grand strategy. There needs to be a greater interaction with possibly countries like India, who are fighting militants every day, who are dealing with problems. The beauty with the United States is it has no threat to its own borders. It has no threat, so it has to imagine what is happening. And therefore, unless you get into these issues, unless your people from the various people involved with us, I'm afraid you'll continue to trust Pakistan. You'll continue to trust irregular forces, and you'll find that you'll be going grossly out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for raising very pertinent points. Thank you. So I would now invite Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh to make his remarks. Sir?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, clear.
I thank IMPRI for inviting me as a discussant to this wonderful talk. And first, at the outset, let me congratulate Dr. Dossani for his clear and very scholarly articulation on grand strategy. And let me also thank for providing his PPT PowerPoint presentation to us very in advance. And my general comments and one or two queries are restricted to his presentation only. Dr. Dossani has explained the definitional aspects of grand strategy and what all constitutes a grand strategy and what it strives to achieve very lucidly, very clearly. He is right that strategic autonomy in grand strategy is not absolute, never absolute, either for small powers, for middle powers, or even for superpowers. And as for superpowers, among other things, their grand strategies are mainly shaped, or one can even say, constrained by their rivals. And this we can see even in India's relations. Of course, we are not in the category of superpower, but we can see this in our relations with Pakistan, China, and with our neighbors. And during the Cold War period, it was the US and the USSR that shaped or constrained each other's choices. And Dr. Dossani has given an overview of both the US as well as Chinese grand strategies and explained how these two strategic rivals of our time are forcing to adjust each other's grand strategy. The arrival of Xi Jinping as China's leader and his aggressive and nationalistic policies were only an inflection point. Otherwise, American disappointment with China had begun much before him. Dr. Dossani has correctly identified that the unexpected high economic growth of China and its unprecedented economic integration with Southeast Asia and East Asia in the first decade of this century posed an economic security risk to the US and its preeminence in the Asia Pacific. Americans had also begun feeling the pinch of losing manufacturing jobs to China. And around 2008, China started asserting itself in the strategic realm, basically in South China Sea, East China Sea, and projecting its power in the sense that the anti-satellite test missile and sending signals that it has global interests by sending its carrier task force, patrolling task force to Gulf of Eden, and started reaching out various regions in the world. So this is in this backdrop. Sometime around 2009, a disappointment with the failure of Nixon-Kissinger perception, what I call Nixon-Kissinger perception on China, that its economic and institutional integration with the world would lead to its democratization, emerged in the US. The pivot to Asia policy of 2011 or 12 was the manifestation of this disappointment and response to the challenge posed by China. And since then, the elite opinion across the spectrum in the US has only coalesced against China. And the Xi Jinping era in China has only seen the intensification of American disappointment. What has struck me most in Dr. Dossani's exposition on the interaction between US and Chinese grand strategies is that China was actually a beneficiary of US institutional approach from 1971 when it replaced Taiwan or the ROC in the United Nations, and to 2001 when it acceded to the WTO under American patronage. However, as China's economic rise exceeded the US expectations and began posing to challenge to its economic position and other factors that just I have mentioned, the US reduced its commitment for institutions. Whether the reduction in US commitments was a well thought out decision as a response to China's rise, or a knee-jerk reaction, or an unrelated independent development is not clear. Dr. Dossani informs that President Obama noted in 2015 that it was America, President Obama noted and stated in 2015 that it was America, not countries like China, who would write the rules of the road in the 21st century. However, the question remains how it would do so without investing in multilateral institutions. In his comparison between China and the Chinese and the US grand strategies, Dr. Dossani underscores that China appears as a supporter of the existing global institutions in which middle powers are seeking strategic autonomy from the US. It basically, China appears as a promoter of new institutions and regional initiatives of global and regional significance for economic cooperation. And more importantly, its bilateral security arrangements are mostly informal. It has invested more in regional security architecture for formal arrangements like SCO. And in contrast, the US has invested less in institutions like the UN and WTO, and also in regional groupings such as ASEAN after 2012. It seems that the US is not able to compete with China there. It has invested more in bilateral relations or deals, the term Dr. Dossani uses, at least in the PPT, with major countries such as Japan and India, who share its discomfort with China. And it has renewed pivot to Asia via Indo-Pacific strategy. Here, I would like to seek a clarification, because in India, for us, Indo-Pacific is not a strategy or military strategy or security strategy. We see it as a natural regional process. So many processes are already underway, and so many other processes we envisage. So we have a difference of view about Indo-Pacific with the US. So here I would like to just ask Dr. Dossani what is his view, whether he considers it as a strategy, and also whether American view has also evolved, because some writers say that American view on the Indo-Pacific has evolved. But coming back to the point that
Dr. Prashant, yes, if you could also just mention the questions that you have for.
I have mentioned the question in my.
Okay, sir.
So coming back to this point, it has renewed pivot to Asia via Indo-Pacific strategy, and the US investment in alternative supply chains that aims long-term decoupling from China can also be considered as part of a containment plan toward China. So in this summation, what Dr. Dossani has given the comparison of these grand strategies, honestly speaking, China looks on a higher normative pedestal and more natural leader-like, whereas the US looks more a challenger and preoccupied with containing China. So, but Dr. Dossani points out that the 2012 pivot to Asia policy started the period of a more adversarial attitude towards China, who was later named as a strategic competitor in 2017 and was identified as America's chief rival. And eventually its approach has moved towards confrontation. Yet his conclusion is that China's actions are less flexible, and some of which will raise geopolitical and economic risk for other powers. So here I expect a little bit more elaboration from him, because the objective of China's grand strategy, as highlighted by him, and the normative setting of these objectives as drawn by him, do not lead to this conclusion naturally. Instead, many would feel that it is actually the US that is indulging in provocations and uncomfortable with China's rise. So here I would also add, perhaps we need to focus a bit more on countries beyond the US, Japan, India, and Australia to understand how other countries in the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Central Asia, and in other regions, basically Southeast Asia, are perceiving China's rise. Because not only about the normative part, which I have highlighted from his PPT only, is the transformative nature of his infrastructure and economic initiatives. What is that is being seen in the regions. We have to see that how the world is seeing who is the challenger now and who is the natural leader. So maybe that will help us to understand American reluctance to invest in multilateral institutions. So these are my comments on Dr. Dossani's presentation, general comments, and the queries which I have made implicit in these comments as a discussion. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Very clearly you have pointed out. Thank you very much, sir. So now, Dr. Dossani, with your permission, we could move to the questions so that you could just take them collectively and respond. So the first question is how the developing countries of South Asia should move ahead with India and China in changed circumstances on the global regimes of East. This is by Dr. Sigdal. There's a question by Ashish Merchant, who says, perhaps we could have the panel's perspective on India's advantages or trade-offs on, one, the remaining non-alignment, aligning deeper with China, example like on the BRI, aligning deeper with the US, which means that more risks with China. There's a question by Hun Ming, who says that China is soon taking over the gradual withdrawal of the US across the world, all across the world. What does your analysis say? Is it this? I mean, I think this is about the vacuum that is being presented by the US, and China is taking advantage of it. There's a question by Sujata ma'am, Sujata Puranik. She asks, what is your estimation about the likely economic implications of BRI on India? And about nationalism, aren't all the countries and their governments successful if they pursue an inward-looking strategies and nationalism? The US is doing it, India is doing it. So why should China's nationalism be a cause of concern to others? Meaning, I think, other countries. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you for all those very interesting questions. Maybe later on I can address my discussants' questions, but let me try and address the audience's questions. So the first question from Dr. Sigdal is that how should the developing countries of South Asia move ahead with India and China in the changing circumstances of global regimes of the East? So I think there are two parts to that. One is the part that is that China's rise and India's rise also, but not as much. And then the recent events in the Middle East. I assume Afghanistan is on your mind. I think, you know, for countries that have sort of cast their lot with China, for example, Pakistan, they will follow the lead of China in this. And China has two issues with Afghanistan. One is, you know, it would like to invest in Afghanistan and bring the Belt and Road Initiative there, but it's also very concerned about the movement of terrorism from Afghanistan to via Central Asia or even more directly into China. Being able to manage those two is a difficult task, was a difficult task even when Afghanistan had a more moderate government under Ashraf Ghani and Karzai. I think it will be a far bigger challenge now. So what South Asian countries will have to do is those that have flexibility, those that have not clearly aligned themselves with one or the other, will be able to, I think, play off one against the other, but in a sense, they are marginal players. Let's face it, just as Afghanistan itself is, from a global point of view, a fairly marginal country. I mean, obviously that doesn't sit well with an Afghan, but, I don't think the export of terrorism is going to be a priority for the Taliban at this point. Governance is, that's what's been in short supply in Afghanistan now for several decades. Fixing that is going to be their challenge, and I doubt that there will be much export of terrorism, at least for the near term, but it'll have to be watched. Let me move on to Ashish Merchant's question about what are India's advantages and trade-offs of remaining non-aligned, aligning deeper with China, aligning more deeply with the US. As I mentioned in my talk, I think from a Chinese point of view, India's made that decision and it's aligned with the US. And I think the Doklam and the Ladakh, issues that came up, the Chinese incursions there, reflect that revision, the revision in the Chinese perception, which was different up to the Wuhan dialogue, which changed completely in the next few years. So I really think that India, in its present trajectory, doesn't have much of a choice but to go with the United States and hope that the US is able to provide the kind of leadership that it needs. The big worry, of course, for India is that the more it does so, the less autonomy it has. So if China then decides to have another incursion into Indian borders, there's very little that the US is going to do about that, and India will be on its own. And we saw what happened in the last one. So I think, India has no choice at this point, but it's on a path that's pretty risky, and steering the ship the other direction is unfortunately doesn't seem to be a choice. It's quite unlike countries in Central Asia, for example, like Kazakhstan, which have been able to play the game quite well by refusing to align, by displaying their independence in various respects. Even countries in Africa, which have done so quite well, particularly in East Africa. Okay, what does Mr. Hun Ming asks, so China is soon taking over with the gradual withdrawal of the US all across the world. What does your analysis say? I think the story of US decline is overstated in terms of technological strength, which is a big driver of future material power. The US remains unparalleled. I think the risk is that if, by putting all these sanctions and so on, it's kind of a gift to China because it will have to catch up, as one of my discussants also mentioned. And it's doing so. It has the capital to invest heavily in catching up, and it will do so. And that's why this dual circulation concept came up, a recognition, in fact, that the local economy is going to drive growth henceforth. So that said, I think the US doesn't want to withdraw. China, I think, has limited ambitions to be safe first in Asia, while continuing to integrate globally. And it has its red lines. From an Indian perspective, the red lines seem to be being drawn quite sharply in a way that makes India uncomfortable. But I would say we're very far from the situation where the US is giving up, notwithstanding what people, you often see articles in Chinese media saying the US is on a decline, and then they point to Afghanistan as an example. The US has this capacity to readjust very quickly. Let's see. I mean, I think that the worry is the non-institutional mode that it's getting into right now. Okay, let's move on to Sujata's question. What in your estimation is going to be the likely economic impact of the BRI in India? Well, India stayed off the BRI, decided not to join, mainly because of China, of course, for one reason, but also the design of the BRI in Pakistan goes through territory that's claimed by India. So India is going to miss out on the BRI. And as I provided some examples for the railway, but there are hundreds of such examples which I didn't give. I've written a whole paper on the impact of the BRI, in Kenya, for example, and how it's changing tourism supply chains with the construction of the standard gauge railway. So My estimation is that the BRI is going to be transformative. It's already shown that in East Africa, it's shown that in Sri Lanka to an extent, it's shown that in South America to a large extent. For example, Uruguay, just one random example, 2/3 of its power capacity now comes from BRI projects. Pakistan, country that was power deficit chronically, is now a power surplus country because of the BRI. So these are transformative changes. So India is missing out on that. But again, I think India doesn't really have a choice. There are strategic elements to the BRI that force you to link up with China that India would find impossible to accept at this stage. Okay, let's go on to the last one. Aren't all countries and the government successful if they pursue an inward nationalism? The US is doing it. India is doing it. What's wrong with China being nationalistic? As the eminent Dr. Shiv Shankar Menon has pointed out, many countries are revisionist. They're all revising their approach to the world, and many of those revisionisms are based on nationalism rising. My own view is nationalism is probably the biggest curse in the world that it's going through, but it's true that it's happening. It's happening in China, it's happening in India, it's happening in the United States. And I think what that does is create significant risk for the rest of the world. With this inward look means that you no longer understand the values of globalization, pluralism, and so on. And in a sense, I think China is, because of its global outlook on trade, is somewhat less nationalistic than others. So let's see how that plays out. I think that answers the question, Simi. Are there any others?
Yes. So if you want to respond to the discussants' questions, and if there is some time, 1 minute, I could present one question to you.
Yeah, you've 3 minutes left and many discussant questions. Yeah, let me just take a couple of one. One is that Dr. Major General Chakravorty raised the issue of the BRI. I think we discussed that. I found his presentation about the military issues and the importance of people to be really, really important and interesting, as well as his concerns about autonomy. He correctly pointed out that the Quad is not a formal initiative. It was started as a quadrilateral security dialogue, but it seems to be expanding its scope. So that's why I put it there, but I didn't really classify it as formal. Dr. Prashant raised the issue of what are the challenges to China? Who is challenging China? What are the regional strategies that can challenge China? I think Japan is the key one. It has military power, as Major Chakravorty pointed out. It has an antagonism towards towards China that's deep-rooted in social and cultural issues. It's an ally of the US. I think the main thing that's preventing Japan from being more aggressive about China is its own internal economy, which is so closely tied up with China that Japanese business people are pushing hard on Japanese foreign policy makers, saying, go slow on your policy of confronting China. So if you look at who can challenge China, I think Japan is one. Vietnam, as General Chakravorty pointed out, has capacity to challenge China. But again, these are mixed, I mean, Vietnam and China are so tightly integrated now economically. And as I pointed out in the Belt and Road in Southeast Asia, there's a railway line that China is building in Vietnam, connecting Kunming down to all the way through Vietnam into Kuala Lumpur. So, challenging China is not going to be easy. I think the only one that can do it really successfully, if at all, is the United States. So let me stop there, and in the interest of time, it's already 12 o'clock.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, sir. Thank you for those responses. Dr. Arjun, if you want to come and have your... Dr. Arjun has just one quick question for you.
Yes, very nice analysis. One thing really pertaining to the economic cycles, we know in US every decade or so there is, the economic cycles, troughs and recession. How do you think that as a phenomena, but more particularly the role of subprime lending crisis in 2008, which extended till 12, and after that, China is also looking very inward for economic stability. What would be the role of these economic cycles in your assessment for the China's grand plan? And another question I really wanted to ask that there is also dearth of economic confidence as also alluded by US and other countries regarding China's economic and technological progress. Also for infrastructure also there is a lot of things people say about ghost towns or the feasibility of any of the BRI project, for example, port and others. How do you see this phenomena? And lastly, Chinese people also focus a lot on culture. And one term which comes again and again is that of century of humiliation. How do you see this as a role pushing China in its grand plan from the Chinese people?
All good questions. Cycles, confidence, and culture, the 3 C's you have raised. If you look at economic cycles, China hasn't really had one for many, many years. The global economic crisis of 2007-8 was fairly short-lived even within the United States. And I think a lot of the credit goes to globalization. It enabled countries to work together to sort things out, both for financial flows as well as economic activity. So my sense is the US is much more likely to go through economic cycles than China, at least in the near term. Although China's population growth is slowing, there's enough slack in the system in terms of agricultural population that can move to industry. The gender imbalance in the workforce, that's a huge benefit to China coming up, that China will continue to grow for many more years to come. So I'm not seeing cycles as a big issue. In terms of confidence, confidence of the US in Chinese technology, in Chinese systems, it's very low. There's a feeling that everything China does has dual purpose and can be exploited by the military for exposing holes in other people's communication systems, water dams, so, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how to address that. I think it's impossible because there's opacity in these things. We don't really know the situation in China, but all we know is that the US is basing their allegations on something. For example, the issue of IP theft. IP theft was labeled by a US House Commission as being about $500 billion a year, which, is absurd. I went into the numbers jointly with Jeffrey Sachs, who's an eminent economist. And we agreed that the number was no more than 30 billion a year. And yet the US sticks with that number because it's politically more appealing than $30 billion a year. I don't know how to address this issue because obviously there's truth in theft about IP theft from China. But until you get on a proper scale, how do you address it is very difficult. Same applies to the pandemic origins issue. And finally, the question of culture, this 100 years, century of humiliation. I think, these are things that are used by leadership very well, to build a certain narrative to gain domestic support. And just like Japan has done so with regard to its role in World War II and earlier as an imperial nation, sometimes the narrative succeeds, sometimes it fails. I think, certainly China, certainly Korea and Japan don't see eye to eye on many things because of this legacy of World War II. And China, likewise, I think, has used the century of humiliation. But that said, I would argue that most nations are pragmatic and look at things on a current basis and a future basis rather than on a past basis. So that's why China had no hesitation sending troops into Vietnam to support the US when it switched sides. Over 100,000 troops went. So I think nations are pragmatic, and that's not an issue. Thanks.
Great, thank you, sir. Very interesting points and questions that have been raised, and definitely this leads to much more in-depth understanding and discussion from all the scholars who have and all those who have attended this and would be watching us later. So now so you're getting a lot of congratulatory messages about your excellent presentation. Thank you, sir. So I would now like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rafiq Dossani, for having spared his time and spoken about China's grand strategy. This is so illuminating. And for all of us interested in the field, I would also like to thank our discussants, Major General Dr. P.K. Chakravorty, and also to Dr. Prashant Kumar Singh for having accepted our invitation and joined us this morning. All the participants who have watched us here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live, thank you very much for your excellent questions. And thank you to all those who will be listening to us on our podcasts and also watching us on YouTube later. So thank you, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.